Hello, everyone. It's Monday, March 23rd. It's just over 2 p.m. here in Montreal, and I'd like to welcome you all to another episode of the Piar Podcast. Today's episode is more relevant than ever given the current geopolitical, socioeconomic, and philosophical differences we see in society today, not just in the United States and here in Canada, but certainly across the globe as well. As communicators are often put in the center of uncertainty and risk, and ultimately that means we find ourselves in rooms where people disagree, even if they're on the same team. So we decided to title this episode Decision Making for Rooms Where Everyone Disagrees. My guest today is Katherine Neebe, SVP and Chief Communications Officer at Duke Energy, one of America's largest utilities. Before stepping into that role earlier last year, she spent time at Walmart leading strategic sustainability initiatives, and before that, managed a $97 million partnership between Coca-Cola and the World Wildlife Fund across more than 45 countries. Katherine, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You've actually said that sitting down in the room where people who will disagree with you is where the magic often gets unlocked. That's exactly the thread that we're pulling on today. And we know you've made a significant career move from Chief Sustainability Officer to Chief Communications Officer, and you've suggested that the skills transfer naturally. Now, what I'm curious about is the opposite. What doesn't transfer? Where, have you had to maybe unlearn something that worked in sustainability but seems to backfire in communications?
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to talk about this shift from sustainability. As you mentioned, I've been in sustainability, stakeholder engagement, philanthropy for 25 years. So my first full year under my belt here in communications. And I know you want to talk about what's been kind of my biggest surprise or the biggest difference, but maybe just first off, just a moment on how these two roles really do translate together, which has been a really pleasant discovery on my end. And I would say fundamentally, both sustainability and communications are really strategic imperatives for an enterprise. They're about understanding stakeholders, understanding the business, bringing that external world inside to the room early, and really helping leaders at a company kind of chart the path forward as they make decisions. And then following some of those decisions, ensuring that you're explaining and kind of doing a little bit of sometimes cleanup afterwards. Both roles are also about that feedback loop. I really think of sustainability and comms as being one of the best ways to understand what's happening externally, talk to different stakeholder groups, bring those insights into the company, and then conversely, understand what's happening inside a company and translate that externally. And in both, credibility really, really matters. Whether you're talking about a climate or you're talking about a crisis, that trust and authenticity are everything. The biggest adjustment for me has been timing or perhaps pace. The world of sustainability, these are challenges, systemic problems that are 100 years in the making and are probably going to take about 100 years to solve. In communications, what I've discovered is sometimes you learn about these things that happened 3 minutes ago, and you need to respond in the next 3 minutes to be effective. So the cadence is completely different. And I would say that's accelerated just given the way people consume and get information, be it TikTok, be it X, be it from their next door neighbor. Another big shift for me has been audience. In sustainability, generally speaking, you're talking to a smaller group of often practitioners, people who are deeply informed. We can debate the merits of that strategy from from a stakeholder standpoint all day long. But in communications, you're trying to reach that audience plus everyone else. And often that everyone else audience, they're busy, they may be skeptical of corporate voice, and they may be encountering an issue for the very first time and have very little interest, appetite, or desire to hear more. So here, you can be technically right in what you're communicating, but if it's not landing in this communications lens in a real way, it just doesn't work. And then another thing that has really been interesting to me as I've stepped into this role is how tangible the world of communications is. Sustainability can be a little theoretical. Take something like resiliency. I've talked for 20 years about resiliency in a very conceptual way. In communications, I think about this winter with a couple of back-to-back winter storms. I'm not talking about resiliency in the theoretical. I'm talking about real people in real homes dealing with real disruption. And that makes the work really immediate and very personal for me. which I love. One of the things that I've definitely developed a more sophisticated or perhaps a deeper appreciation for stepping into this role is the blend in communications of art and science. It always kind of I've been around communications. I think one of the challenges with communications, right, is that everyone thinks they know how to communicate. Therefore, you're trying to really pursue a craft here. But I didn't really appreciate the sophistication, the range of tools, the precision that is needed, the preparation that is required. It's a real craft, and it's been a real joy for me to learn from the team and see how they have arrived at their careers, developed their careers, and how they're advising me to be smarter and more sophisticated. And I know I've talked a little bit about what unites them, and then what's perhaps been a discovery for me. But I think at my core, like of so many other people, I'm very mission driven, very purpose driven. And I think it's been a real privilege to work at a company like Duke Energy, where kind of no matter your seat, you're connected to mission, value, purpose, reliability, affordability, resiliency, climate, economic strength, economic competitiveness. These are all really, really important issues that are incredibly dynamic in a time of just incredible polarization to your earlier comments. And so I'm still getting to work at that intersection just from the standpoint of comms, where the lens is just a little sharper and a little faster.
And Axio's research on Fortune 100 CEOs found that only 17% of them came from PR agencies, 8% of them came from journalism, 43% started in the broader corporate world, suggesting that it's not all that uncommon after all. Do you think that it's the perspectives, the fresh perspectives, which are why the board's appointing these leaders from the rest of the business, or do you think maybe it boils down to something else?
That's a great question. When I was younger in my career, I thought a little bit differently than a lot of other people, and I thought that was a liability. The older I've gotten and the more experience and wisdom I've gained, the more I've realized that bringing that perspective in, having a slightly different view from the herd, can actually be really, really helpful. And I think anyone stepping into a leading role in a corporation now has got to have a capability and ability to scan the horizon, understand where the puck is today. You're Canadian, so can I go with a puck
Yes,
metaphor?
of course.
So where the puck is today and then where the puck is going, and making sure you're helping the business kind of skate in that direction. I think another thing, and maybe this is the liberal arts major in me, that I deeply value and think is incredibly important, no matter what level of a company or an organization you're in, but particularly as you start having decisions with more and more ramifications, is this notion of critical thinking. We've got to be able to challenge ideas, test assumptions, make sure that we've got kind of a fulsome evaluation and understanding, and be just as critical of our own thoughts as the ideas that are put forward by others.
That's brilliant. And Catherine, so you said that sitting down in a room with people who will disagree with you is where the magic gets unlocked. What's the right framework for making that kind of room work? Like, who belongs in it? How should the agenda be structured? And what should happen when a disagreement does not sort of get resolved?
I love being in a room where there are a bunch of different perspectives that are put forward. It's just one of my favorite places to be, and it can be so uncomfortable, but to me, when you're surrounding yourself with people who have different perspectives, different experiences and different knowledge, that's where I learn and grow as a human being. So I find that just personally really really rewarding, and I'm smart enough to know that I'm not the smartest person in the world. So I need to surround myself very intentionally with other people who are smarter than I am, to make sure that as I'm helping to advise companies on direction of travel, that I've done my level best to ensure that I've got the right kind of path forward. And for what it's worth, my experience working in corporations is there's a real vulnerability or a liability where companies like to be in that little corporate bubble. And no matter what they do, they're kind of in it, where you surround yourself with people who think like you, who may look like you, who have similar experiences to you, and you test ideas with a focus group of one. And then you convince yourself that you're right. And that just sometimes often doesn't hold up externally. So I kind of orient around two principles for this room of people that disagree, or or kind of deep stakeholder engagement. And the first one is that reasonable people can disagree. The second one is instead of looking for compromise or trade off, let's look for how do we optimize the system. So we'll start with reasonable people can disagree. My experience is that often that disagreement isn't about perhaps the ultimate outcome. It's about what someone needs, perhaps the timeline that they are operating in, what they value most relative to other things. And it's okay for someone to not agree with you. For some reason people get tied up on that, but it happens all the time, and it's human. It's what makes this diversity of thought, diversity of perspective makes the work richer. And then the second one on optimizing for outcomes is so important to me because when you sit down to talk to people, if you start from a place of trade-off, if you start from a place of compromise, you're in a less mindset versus when you're talking about how do we optimize, you're in kind of fundamentally just the mindset is maximum. It's how do we it's one of opportunity. And I just think that those two mindset tweaks are so essential. And then it's pretty straightforward. I would say you put the right people in the room, people who see the issue differently, who are close to the real world impact, have authority to speak on behalf of the group that they're representing. You'll want to bring in the operators, you'll want to bring in the critics, you'll want to bring in the partners, not just the senior leaders or the familiar faces. I would also say the agenda really matters in these scenarios. Aligning on an outcome, what we're actually trying to solve for, and over what time horizon, making sure that you really have clarified the direction of travel before you start to get into it. And then that really helps to lower the temperature in the room. And then another thing, and I learned this in my WWF, the Pandas Not the Wrestlers days, it's really important, this framework, theory of action, theory of change. So theory of change, what is the change that we would like to see in this world? It's usually a system level change. And then theory of action is, okay, if this is the outcome and this is my theory for all of the things that need to happen to get there, then my theory of action is what do I, Katherine Neebe, or what do I, Duke Energy, do concretely, discreetly to help solve towards that ultimate outcome. I just think that kind of framing is helpful because if people aren't in agreement on theory of change or theory of action, they're never going to agree on kind of what is the next 1, 2, or 3 step. All of that is I mean, it's not always rocket science, but what I'll tell you is the thing that I have found to be the most incredible unlock in these places, in these forums where people disagree, is experiential storytelling. When I was at WWF, we called it walking in each other's shoes. When I was at Walmart, we called it eat what you cook. Now that I'm at Duke Energy, we don't call it anything, but but it's the same principle. It's that you experience the world through someone else's eyes, and you really have to experience it. When I was at WWF, we would go into a manufacturing facility. They always thought that we were going to like chain ourselves to the fence or something. We were environmentalists. But it was really to go in and meet with the plant manager. What keeps him or her up at night? What are their top 3 priorities in a given day? What do they think is top of mind for them to be solving? What is their perception of the environment? And then conversely, to take those plant managers out into the field with the WWF colleagues, with the environmental community, and say, this is the river basin from which the water that is the main ingredient in your product is derived. So let's talk about the water quality issues. Let's talk about pollution, perhaps, or drought, or what have you. And so that helps kind of shift both parties' reality in a really, really interesting way from an us versus them to let's come at this problem perhaps with different angles, different perspectives. It has to be deep and meaningful. It can't be cursory. It's the most powerful way that I've ever seen to drive towards solution. And here's like a really cool thing about my new seat in communications. It's where communications plays a role. I can't take everyone out to look for special ducks in the Mekong or wander palm oil plantations in Sumatra, or here at Duke, go see the satellite monitoring that we have in place, which is incredibly amazing on methane emissions. You can't even see methane emissions with your own eyes. And so communications is such a powerful lever to tell a story, to bring people in, to show them something they may not have seen, to show them something they may not have understood. And now with all of these formats people have to consume information, podcasts like the one you and I are on, the one that you have kindly hosted and offered and invited me to, or TikTok or X or you name it. People can really experience the world in new and different ways.
And so what I'm hearing, like between the lines, is that with the right framing in place, you're able to tap into the empathy factor of the people
Mhm.
around the table. And the empathy is the unlock to reducing the risk of that disagreement spiraling out of control to the point where we've crossed the line of a rule like reasonable people can disagree. Is that
I
the
think
right sort of
that's
thing?
right. Yeah, I think that's right. But I think there's also a component to it of understanding that different perceptions are valuable instead of roadblocks. There's something really, really um, that's a huge unlock when people kind of take off ego, take off I'm solving for me, like take off their jerseys and meet as human beings.
Absolutely. And then so that's the best practice that you'll never read in a textbook. That's the stuff that you're going to hear straight from the CCO of Duke Energy Corporation on this podcast, type of a thing. But now, even if you didn't experience it directly, if it's just theoretically or with peers that you've seen, would you be able to share a little bit of insight on what does it look like when the room doesn't work out? When you've done, let's say, everything right, quote unquote, but people still are leaving without this resolution. How do you make the decision then? Is it a timing thing? What happens when things fail? How do you move from there?
I mean, I think you have to assume things fail. That's okay. That's part of the process. You don't break bread every single time and lead to family. And I think you just have to keep at it. I always start when things go sideways with what I can control. And what I can control is me, my reaction to things, and what I brought in. So, where I've seen things fall apart is I brought in an assumption without testing it beforehand, where I brought in an agenda and I thought we needed to solve for X, but we hadn't even established that we needed to do math before we could get to solve for X, where I or someone else was not seen as a trusted broker. People didn't know who I was. So I've seen things fail all of the time, or maybe I'll rephrase because I don't really totally believe in failure. I've made plenty of mistakes along the way. My view of failure is you keep making the same friggin' mistake over and over, and that's a different
Right.
thing. But I always look inward when things don't go right of what did I not bring? What did I not assume correctly? That's kind of where I start when things fall apart. And then I go back and I fight for another day. That's the beauty of sustainability. You learn that no is never going to be a no. You just have to figure out what are the conditions for yes.
Wow, that's so deep, honestly, and it's a philosophical thing, right? And that's actually a good segue into the next question because your philosophy centers on transparency, building trust, and so I wanted to, I'm curious about where does that approach tend to sometimes break down? How should a communicator think about the difference between genuine openness and giving stakeholders more information that they can actually use?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the answer is you're always kind of trying to get it right. For me, I always start from a place of transparency works when you're seeking to answer the questions people are truly asking you. And there's a nuance. Are they asking you the question or are they asking you the polite version of the question? Or do they not know the question to ask? But really making sure you're meeting them with the information that is at the root of their question, that you're doing it in a curated way, that you're not dumping a load of information, hoping that they can find the kernel of truth within. It doesn't mean being open to sharing everything, it means sharing information that is relevant, usable, and honest. Something I've learned deeply at Duke. Walmart and WWF were relatively straightforward, straightforward companies, but at utility, the energy sector, it's incredibly technical. It's incredibly complex. So there's got to be a sophistication in translating that complexity into information that people can use to form an opinion. You don't want to hide behind technical language. You don't want to not use it, but precision really matters with language. What I've seen is if your audience doesn't understand what you're saying, it just creates space for misunderstanding, for the information to be manipulated, and that serves no one particularly well, in my opinion. Another area where I've seen transparency break down is there's such a bias for corporations to only tell the good story, the good news. Not maybe the neutral news or the hard news. And all of it has to be done carefully. But I would say people don't believe perfection. So if all you're sharing is the good news, then really no one believes, they're automatically skeptical. But my experience, and this just is translated for every company I've worked at or with, is that in today's low trust environment, never talking about the hard or even the neutral actually means stakeholders interpret information even worse than perhaps reality. So you're better off just sharing the good, the bad, and sometimes the ugly. And I even think about now at Duke, we've been navigating energy transition, energy dominance during a time of just massive load growth due to economic development and AI plus plus, and that put pressure on our coal retirements. So we had to be honest about what's driving an extension of an exit from coal, which originally was scheduled for 2030, 2035. We're continuing to invest in renewables. We're continuing to invest in batteries. We're extending the life of our nuclear plants. But we have to be honest and open about what it takes to keep the lights on, to keep bills as low as possible as we meet this elevated energy demand in our system. For me, really the sweet spot is being honest about complexity, clear about the constraints, and transparent enough so even if people don't agree with you, they trust you.
That's brilliant. Deloitte had a 2024 global human capital trends survey. It was like 14,000 businesses. There were business and HR leaders across
Mhm.
95 countries. Found that 86% of leaders believe more transparency produces more workforce trust. But the researchers, they concluded that actually the relationship is significantly more complicated and nuanced than that assumption suggests. That's really speaks, in my mind, to the point that you made about is it you're answering a question that the stakeholders really are asking. Is it the polite version of the question? And I think that from a strategic perspective, the communications leader really benefits from knowing it's like a superpower and a
Mhm.
skill to have, especially for 2026 and beyond, is like knowing what questions are the right questions to ask, being able to answer questions that maybe haven't even been asked yet, or like being able to see project out into the future, know what those questions might be. It sounds like it's aligned to your thinking of it, and the way that you've explained it is a lot more nuanced, it looks like, than just simply, hey, let's just be as transparent as possible. That's going to build all the trust. There's no silver bullet solution, isn't it?
Yeah. No, it's a constant test of have I answered the core of what someone needs to know from me, and can I answer it? Sometimes the answer is I don't know. We're figuring it out, and that's honest. And I don't know why people sometimes fear being honest, and I think fundamentally it's the kindest thing to do to yourself and for others.
And so earlier you had mentioned about the pace of communications being something that maybe you had to adjust to, for example, and how you learned about information 3 minutes ago and now you have 3 minutes to respond. That creates a type of pressure for the communicator. It's not a uncommon scenario that the audiences of this podcast would be in. At the same time, since we're talking about disclosure or transparency and where that line can be, and we know that it's always something you need to continually work on, but can you think of a situation where maybe it was you or a peer, or you've seen something where they've disclosed something voluntarily but wish they hadn't, where the timing maybe made an honest message perhaps land badly, or a situation where maybe it was too fast to respond and maybe further context came out afterwards? I know I'm putting you on the spot, but
Yeah, you are, and I wish I had a really good example. I think in sustainability, things are so considered with the professionalization of the reporting that I mean now you've got like audit involved and the financial committee, and so it slows the pace of what is communicated. In comms, like I could see a world where you would say something, then uh, I think the worst case scenario in comms when you're moving quickly is just simply being wrong about information. And I see that it predates my time, but not my time, but my time running comms at Duke. But during Hurricane Helene, there was a rumor that circulated externally about a real potential challenge with a waterway in Western North Carolina. And we obviously were getting a lot of pressure to respond about what we were doing about this situation on the ground that was unfolding during a time of real catastrophic impact in the region. And we, again, this is not me, but the team held back on responding until we could send someone out to put eyes on that specific watershed and say, I'm looking at it. I know what I'm supposed to be looking for. And the rumor is not true. What is being said is not happening. So we were able to buy ourselves a few hours to verify the reality on the ground to ensure that we were actually providing accurate information. And it's so hard when you're there and you're getting all of these inquiries and all of this interest to make sure that you're always being as honest as you can with the information you have in a responsible way. And so I just think as long as you're kind of keeping to those guardrails, you're better off.
Honesty, integrity, choosing to verify as opposed to choosing to react quickly. Those are all signs of great leadership, and I think the communications leaders need to heed the warning that it's faster isn't always better necessarily.
Yeah.
Now to
Well, I
shift
think
gears.
not
Yeah,
to I know you're trying to shift gears, but I even think about AI and the
yeah.
deep fakes and all of there's so much that's gonna help the world with AI, but there's some real dark sides. And so as communicators, just making sure we've got some sophistication around the implications of that will be really important.
And Catherine, you bring up a really good point because we're in a reality where execution is happening at the speed of AI. You simply have an instruction, a prompt, a campaign idea, and before you know it, you can execute on that. You can send out that tweet, you can send out that press release, you can message that journalist. But if we are moving so quickly, that means that we also are amplifying the risk of moving the wrong directions. And so that stop and take a breath, take a temperature check, verify information factually for correctness. That is where the judgment comes in. And I think these are the sort of things that simply cannot be relegated to the machines because as good as the machines get at executing that human part uh, of decision making quality of judgment, weighing trade offs. Those are the things that we need to. They're muscles we need.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the machines are really good at synthesizing information that has already happened. Humans are really good about figuring out the future.
I
So,
couldn't agree more.
yeah.
Now, to shift gears, Catherine, you've described the holy grail of communications measurement as proving you've actually changed behavior. And to reference early the theory of action and the theory of change that you had mentioned, not just generated impressions or coverage like vanity metrics, but you've also said that this remains unsolved. What's the right way for a CCO to build the internal case for investment, especially in instances when the most important outcomes are yet to be proven?
Yeah. Yeah. This has turns out it was the holy grail in sustainability and it's now the holy grail in
Wow.
communications. I'm always looking for that really satisfying metric of impact. But maybe I'll start with how I think about measurement and I kind of bucket them into three different categories: input, output, and impact. Input, probably the easiest to measure, but also the least satisfying. Here, I'm thinking about dollars spent. So, it's your annual budget, the number of campaigns you've launched, the number of posts you've published, number of press releases issued. Necessary work, but not the point. Then my mind goes to output metrics. This is a lot more familiar information for communicators, but impressions, reach, media coverage, also very helpful signals, but not really the holy grail. And then I get to impact, which hardest question. Did anything actually change? Did people think or behave differently or trust us more as a result of the information that they saw or heard or consumed from Duke? And the other kind of impact to all of this is the reality is that impact is not a fixed destination. Even if you change someone's perception in a moment, they're human and the world keeps moving around them. So you never really arrive at that destination. It's always a journey. Doesn't mean you don't measure, it just means you measure a little differently, and then you recognize the constraints of measurement and the opportunity set that they provide. I've always found that the strongest case for investment comes from pairing outputs with some of those sophisticated listening tools. I happen to love, like so many communicators, the basics of polling, focus groups, ongoing stakeholder research so you can stay really close to what customers and stakeholders care about in that moment and whether or not you're showing up in the right way. When we talk about the internal case for communications, it's not about proving perfect attribution or tying every action to specific behavior change. Like, I can certainly point to campaigns and tie it to NPS, or we use MQS, media quality score, now to look at the effectiveness of our media response. But it's really about showing discipline, being clear about what we're trying to influence, measuring consistently, and then using what we're learning in real time to check and adjust. And I I think it's so important. It goes back to what I said at the very start, which is communications is fundamentally a strategic imperative for a company. So we're both a growth lever and also an investment in the resiliency of a company, because I feel like trust, this amorphous kind of thing that's so important to the company's brand, is always on the line. And you can't wait for crisis to realize you needed to have invested in communications earlier. What we can show is that we're informed, we're intentional, we're responsive, and that's what's building and protecting the brand.
As a measurement geek myself, this is my jam right here, this topic, especially. And what we know as comms leaders is that it boils down to awareness, confidence, and trust. And while marketing can do a terrific job of building awareness, maybe beyond anything else, it's really the trust and confidence factor where communications is worth its weight in gold, essentially. And one thing that we find is that, the holy grail framing tends to only come from people who are self-aware enough to admit that there is a gap that exists, right? And so that shows a level of intellectual humility. And we've explored this pretty in detail, even just on the show, and we've landed on the view that actually it boils down to a data science or math problem. You can't causation in communications because of all that. Um,
Mhm.
Uncertainty. But what you certainly can do is work in reverse and rule out what didn't cause that impact. And beyond that, you can also measure the multiplier effect. So how much more effective your marketing and sales has become, let's say, for example, when communications is present versus when it isn't. And that's usually a number you can take to the CFO. Have you sort of come across that approach before?
Certainly, actually, as you were talking, we're earlier days in this, but one of the things we've been watching is the shift in sources from traditional, let's say, a Google search to the generative Google search, and what are is the data set that those two different searches are pulling from. What I love about what we've seen is, as we've moved to this generative kind of AI search, what we're finding is it's actually the Duke Energy website, the Duke Energy press releases, the kind of brass tacks of comms that are generating the most output. So now when I go, right, the big issue of the day is cost of living crisis, affordability. When I do a Google search for why is my bill whatever it is, it points to Duke Energy sources in a way that it perhaps didn't even 2 years ago. And so, I don't know what that says other than our media relations, our communications is effective in getting our message and our story out there on an issue that our customers care deeply about.
Great point as well. Sort of treating that AI as a stakeholder, essentially, right? You're feeding it the right information so that it can then do what it needs to do to serve the objectives of the organization strategically. So, what should the feedback loop look like for a crisis playbook that has never been tested against reality? So, it's a bit of a shift here, but how would you or like a CCO know before the headline arrives whether their preparation would actually hold?
I'm a big advocate in never letting a document sit on a shelf unused. I'm a big believer that even when you have a perfect document, the real world collides with theoretical, and you need to be nimble and able to adjust in real time. So I believe the feedback loop has to have regular, realistic testing. We run multiple playbooks. And do tabletop exercises, not just once, but repeatedly. And this really helps our team build that muscle memory. I'm in a desktop every year. We've got, which with senior leaders across Duke Energy, then we've got a couple of desktops that we're planning later this year with just the communicators, simulations that are ripped from the headlines, as they say, where my department would obviously be involved. And so it's a real opportunity for myself to get some muscle memory and then the team to get some muscle memory on what they might do, think, or what should we be saying externally in the event of crisis. And here the goal is that muscle memory alongside my core belief that calm is contagious. So if people know their role instinctively, if the organization shows up to that crisis with that kind of steady mindset and is credible under pressure, I think we're already ahead of the game. We didn't have a hurricane last year. I've been in comms for a year and we live in a hurricane prone zone. We work in a hurricane prone zone and we didn't have one. So my first real experience in a massive kind of crisis communication was Winter Storm Fern, and we stood up what we call the JIC. And it really was incredible to see how the team operated with playbook and roles and responsibilities and areas of focus and ran that playbook to perfection, but also adjusted with trust and openness and some of that real time problem solving. And I'll tell you that the culture in the room matters so much. It matters to me. It matters to our team's effectiveness. The ability to talk through ideas, try some new approaches, adapt quickly when the situation on the ground changes, and us as communicators feeling like we're in a safe space to talk through issues, maybe challenges the business is encountering, problem solve, and figure it out. And the feedback loop doesn't end once we had a successful storm response or a successful tabletop. We're very disciplined about always doing I call them COEs. Sometimes there's celebrations of excellence, and sometimes there's corrections of errors. Sometimes there's a little bit of both, but always having a COE after kind of significant events so that we're able to identify what we would want to do differently moving forward. And even when we have a really good response, part of the continuous learning, the growth mindset is always identifying actions to take. And for example, in the wake of Winter Storm Fern, we realized we had a lot of spokespeople out in the field from very remote locations, sometimes with poor lighting or unreliable internet connections. So we created Go Packs that we've now got in all of our offices so that when people need to hit the road last minute, we also got hats because we don't usually have winter storms, some branded hats, but really making sure that we're not just identifying the corrective action or the celebration, but that we're actually following up with real action.
And it's interesting because the BCI Emergency and Crisis Comms report for 2025 found that while 75% of organizations carried out training programs at least once in 2024, and over 80% exercised their plans with similar frequencies, they're running these exercises. It was the human factors that remained the leading cause of plan failure. So I love when you said that training the muscle memory, calm is contagious. It's the culture that matters in those moments. And now, with you being so dialed in to the crisis responses and stuff like that, because it comes with the territory, you're in the energy sector, the risk levels are so prevalent. What sort of advice would you give to people who don't perceive themselves as being in such a let's say volatile environment about crisis comms and being ready for crisis scenarios? Is there some sort of advice that you would give them that maybe they're thinking they're a little bit safe, maybe they're thinking
Yeah, they may be.
these crises don't occur?
They may be. My hope is that no one. I mean, a crisis is really tough. It impacts real people, and the consequences can be devastating. So I hope that that it is a theoretical problem, but I think for most of us, it's a real problem. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So I would say this. I would say sit down with your security teams, sit down with your operators, sit down with your enterprise or corporate strategy and risk team. Really walk through what are some known knowns, walk through what is the, I can never remember what color of swan we're on, walk through like what is a black swan event or a green swan. I can't remember what color swan, but walk through the swan events and then walk through some things that might not actually be devastating to the enterprise, but something where you're gonna have to there's a data breach or there's a, something, that feels like it's in the land of potentially real for people. And how would you respond? Does everyone have clarity on role? Do you have contingency plans? Do you have decision making criteria? Do you know who your top three media outlets might be? And so it's not the exercise is not about putting something on paper that's exactly right. The exercise is creating the environment to understand what you would do in the actual event of a crisis.
Before I let you go, Catherine, I just want to reflect on what we covered today because I think it really deserves a moment. It's an achievement. We talked about what it actually takes to lead communications through genuine complexity, not the managed kind, but the kind where the people in the room fundamentally see the world differently. We got into transparency and where its limits are. We got into measurement and what it means to make confident decisions when the evidence isn't necessarily clean. And we talked about playbooks, like the gap between having a plan and like trusting the plan. And what I'll take away from this conversation is the skill that you sort of keep coming back to isn't a calm skill per se at all. It's actually a judgment skill, and I think that's exactly what, the show's about. So, Catherine, thank you so much for your time and for your candor that you brought to this conversation today. I really do appreciate it. And to everyone listening, I hope this one gave you something to think about, not just something to, note down. And we'll see you for the next episode.